hope about understanding how God works in the world. And while the question of evil and suffering has a kind of standard theological framework and approach, I've tried to approach it in what I think is a more natural way of doing it rather than starting with the theology and working backwards, starting with the sense of where is God in the world, what he's doing, how are we going to interact with that, what do we expect of him and from him, and what does it mean to pray and those kind of things. But because we finally got to week 4, I thought I ought to at least give some kind of acknowledgement to the theological framework for the question. And the question of evil and suffering usually comes under the heading of Theodicy. And so I'm just, so the first page has just got some stuff on Theodicy. The problem of Theodicy, how can God be a good God when the world has evil and suffering in it, really is generated out of a context of meticulous providence. That's what we've been talking about there. That's week 1, we were talking about how some people thought God controlled everything. And if God controlled everything and there is evil in the world, well, you've got a theological problem. And this is kind of the context. So if, and this I would argue as in support of my own view, if the Bible doesn't particularly address theodicy, it may be because theodicy has started with that meticulous providence of view that the Bible isn't really trying to argue for. And so it doesn't really address it directly. And it's one of my standard rules, I've got a couple of them, one of my standard rules is that if the church has been arguing about something for hundreds of years, it's probably because they're asking the wrong question. Because when the church argues, it pulls from the Bible, it pulls from theology, it pulls, everybody's making a lot of sense, but they can't all be right. Maybe they could all be wrong, but they can't all be right. And so I'm inclined to think at that point that they're just arguing about the wrong thing. And if they step back, reframe the question, then they might find that they could agree a bit more. So my solution, of course, is the one that where everybody would agree. But if only they would listen to me. But essentially, for me, I try and start this conversation in terms of God is love rather than God is power. And I think that kind of takes us in a different kind of direction. But the context for theodicy is usually that context of God is power. So theodicy is a term coined from 2 Greek words suggesting justification of God. Now that's a really interesting meaning for theodicy. Do we really need to justify God? And to whom are we justifying God? I kind of feel like while we should be praising God and speaking about God, if we have to justify God, then maybe we've got, again, we're slightly off track with the approach. But this idea of justifying God has been fairly common in theology. It goes back to maybe the 5th century. Once people started to get that St. Augustine idea of God controls everything, then this question kept coming up. So the problem is expressed in 3 asserted truths. I put truths in quotation marks because I'm not agreeing with them all, but 3 truths. And the first truth is God is all-powerful. The second truth is God is loving and perfectly good. And the third truth is there is evil and suffering in the world. So those are 3 truths. And instinctively, a lot of Christians would want to nod in agreement to all 3. But the trouble is, logically, you have a problem with saying all 3 things at the same time. So if God is all-powerful, loving, and perfectly good, then there would be no evil and suffering in the world. So that would be, if you've got God as powerful, all-powerful, and God is loving and good, then you get rid of proposition 3, that there is evil in the world. You may remember that's kind of what Calvin did when he said that everything comes from God and God is loving and just. So if you think it's evil, it's just because you don't understand what God is doing. So he's got 1 and 2. He's sure about that, but he's had to kind of undermine the reality of evil and turn it into just our misunderstanding of what God is doing. And that's why when I did the 2 sermons, the first one is God is love, and the second one is evil is real, but not forever. But the evil is real bit is, I think, I'm not particularly willing to give up. I think evil is real. If God is all powerful and there is evil and suffering in the world, then God is not loving and good. So assertion 2 is denied. If God is loving and good and there is evil in the world, then God is not all powerful. So you've denied assertion number 1. If you've read Rabbi Kushner, Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People, which was a really popular book when it came out, that's kind of the position he ends up in. God is loving and good. There is evil and suffering in the world. His 14-year-old son died of a very rare disease of premature aging. So he basically died of old age by the time he was 14. And in wrestling with that, you get why do bad things happen to good people? And his thing was God is loving. God is, there is evil in the world. So God is not all powerful. That's the way he took it. So almost all the debates around theodicy take these 3 as a starting point and then try and make them fit. And Erickson, I think, is right when he says to make them fit, you actually have to quibble on the meaning of one of them to kind of get them all to come back together. And for a lot of theological debate around this issue of theodicy is trying to make an argument for which, what do you prioritize in this list of 3? So my approach then is to give up trying to make the 3 work and actually start with what I think is a stronger truth. God is love. That love is not non-coercive because it's the open love of the Trinity. And therefore, when I say God is all-powerful, I mean all-powerful within the framework of the fact that he is love. And so it's not an example of God's power to force people to do something evil because he is love. So you're in that kind of, can God create a rock so big that he can't lift it? It sounds like that's a tricky problem. What is God going to do about that? It's a stupid problem because it's the statement itself is nonsensical. Creating something that you can't lift. I mean, it's just not a doable thing. So it sounds clever, but it doesn't actually mean anything. And so what I would argue by saying that God is all-powerful without limits, it's just a meaningless thing. God himself is first love. That defines what he means by power. And so all across these 4 weeks, that's kind of the direction I've been kind of spinning the conversation in terms of how I understand what God is doing. God is first love. That love is non-coercive. Therefore, when I say that God is all-powerful, I mean God can do what I mean essentially is that God will win in the end. God will win in the end. And even though along the way, he's not controlling all things, God's kingship is about him winning on the end. And we'll pick that up again tonight. So I've got kind of modified approach. What I want to, and this this I feel fairly strongly about, is that what the Bible is discussing is not the origin of the evil. So therefore, how do we fit all these three things together and stuff? But it's always about the exodus of evil. How does evil get overcome? And it's my theory that theologians like to discuss the abstraction of the question, where does evil come from, and what does that mean about God, rather than actually get in there and fix the problems of the world. Because I think as we read the Bible, we continually challenge to actually get in there and fight evil. And so if you're standing back saying, oh, I wonder why this evil exists, and you're not actually doing anything to alleviate the suffering and to work towards justice, you've kind of missed the biblical framework for dealing with this kind of thing. So the exodus of evil, the overcoming of evil, is, I think, the biblical issue. Right? Does that kind of make sense? All right. So God is sovereign, but evil, so therefore evil is not forever. So Boyd and Pinnock describe what they express what they see within the Bible as saying the Bible has a warfare worldview that is concerned with the defeat of evil. And they're kind of two theologians. I read them and think, well, that was fairly obvious. How come nobody else said it? But I think that's fairly obvious. If you read through the Bible, God is constantly at war with evil to overcome it, not sitting in the background, manipulating it, kind of manipulating people to achieve his ends via evil or sin. God is out there confronting it. I mean, Easter is coming up. What more could? Is there a better picture of God's approach to evil? He's not down there with the Pharisees and the chief priests arguing about evil and why does it exist, and does God want it to be? He's actually on the cross dying as a victim of the world's evil in order to redeem and reconcile the world to himself. I just think we're Christians. Once you've seen that, where else would you go? I mean, what other direction would you go with this kind of stuff? If we're following Jesus, we're following him into the situation and through the situation to redeem it and bring people back to God. The exodus of evil, the overcoming of it, rather than arguing about its origins. So the Bible describes a war going on with evil that we have to fight, not a problem with evil that we have to solve. So that's my excuse for not solving it. But at the end, if we here could do what nobody else has done in 1400 years, 1600 years, and solve the problem of theodicy, would we have made any difference to what's going on outside? No. So if we gain a better understanding of who God is and what God is doing in the world, and we follow him into suffering and evil, would the world be a better place? Well, I think it would be. I kind of really, after 4 weeks, if you remember nothing else, it's that we're with God fighting evil, not standing apart trying to solve it as an intellectual problem.
Stephen, are we fighting evil, or are we using his assistance and guidance to pass through it? Are we fighting it?
I think I would want to say that what you're describing perhaps is more enduring suffering. What I'm thinking of when I'm talking like this is more overcoming injustice. So I think personally, yes, perseverance in suffering is often about endurance, but I don't want the kind of passive endurance that lets an unjust act continue. Yeah. So I want a kind of both end, but I was putting the emphasis more on the fighting injustice rather than just enduring suffering. Yeah.
Is evil not man's greed and power?
Yes, but probably more. So when I do my little diagram, I have sin, evil, and chaos as the kind of the bad things. So sin I see as our responsibility, things that our choices to do the wrong thing, our choice to stand away from God rather than moving towards God.
Should our prayer not be to change the hearts of these people that are evil? Or for God to change the heart?
Yeah, well, that I guess part of my thing would be, how would God change the heart of that person? Well, what I'm saying is probably he's calling us to be involved in that by standing alongside those who are marginalized or being abused, using our power to protect them or to challenge it. Although I must admit, when I think of some of the great heroes who have stood against evil, not very long, because evil is just totally destructive. I mean, I think, I don't know why, but I think of Nazi Germany. Not that I was ever in Nazi Germany, but I mean, you had a few people like Bonhoeffer standing against the evil, and you had a whole lot of other Christians just going along with it. And if you stepped out of that going along with it, then you had the SS trying to kill you, or, and the courage it must take to do that. But I think that's the kind of courage that we're called to. It's a little bit more complicated when I try and work out what I'm meant to be doing in 2024 in Australia. What are the places where I'm meant to use my power to help protect people rather than just stand by, and because it's not affecting me directly, I'm okay with it. So I think there's personal sin, but I also think personal sin has become capital S sin. Paul talks about it in a way of it's personified, and so I think racism, for example, is a capital S sin, because even while we might be small racists in our own way, every one of us has this prejudice for our type of person and against other types of persons. But there's small things, and we try and be kind on this level. But when you start to look at how society as a whole is functioning, which we're part of, I mean, it's clearly there's racist forces driving through, and we, if you're white middle class male, you can kind of stand apart from that and let it kind of sweep past. It's not my sin, but it's sin with a capital S that I really should be doing something about. So I also, pardon? Speaking up, standing up, offering a hand, being, what do they call it? An ally. I mean, what's the yeah, but I'm thinking, Yeah, I mean, that kind of thing. I mean, being the person who's is a supportive friend. I may not be black, I may not be victimized, but I can stand with people who are, because I recognize that as an evil that God is against, even if I'm not personally sinning against someone in that, or at least trying not to. And then I think the spiritual powers and how they work, it's a little less clear to me. But again, I don't, by and large, I don't think spiritual powers are making us sinners. But I think spiritual powers are probably taking advantage of and manipulating our sin. And chaos, just the randomness of the world.
It's like a prayer group on that very thing.
Yeah?
On that
Yeah.
very thing, to try and get God somehow to change the hearts of these people, not to be evil. Don't know how.
Well, yeah.
I think I want to preach on this in a couple of weeks.
Yeah?
I think.
Yeah?
Because I think in the area of prayer, we can get a bit confused sometimes
Mm-hmm.
between when we're praying for the thing of evil.
Against evil. Yeah.
Against evil, and when we're praying for people, and so when we're praying against systems of injustice, and when we're praying for people, and so, but I think the one thing I would say to that is that when we're going to pray for people, I think it's really important that we first of all, God loves that person.
Yes.
Pray for them. So whatever we pray has to fit in that thing of God is love.
Yeah.
And so that God would have mercy on that person, that God would open their eyes to the life of Jesus Christ in their own life, so that we're coming with a lot more humility in our prayers, I think.
Yeah.
The power over in our prayers over people.
Yeah, it's not trying to, yeah.
God change them, but Lord have mercy on them, Lord.
And part of that has to be our willingness to be part of the solution to that, yeah. Not standing apart and saying, God, fix them.
Yeah.
Well, no.
Yeah, it's a both kind of thing. But it sounds to me like the answer's coming in 2 weeks. So that's something to look forward to. So,
10 minutes.
oh no, you'll need a whole 12. You'll need the whole 12, like we usually use. You know, the terrible thing, it's a terrible thing, the fact that we record the sermons and put them online. It's John's fault. So he records them, puts them online, and you can instantly see how long it was. So I can't say to Cole, oh, that was only 15 minutes, because the evidence is against me. So anyway. It does if John's included it in the actual film. No. 12 minutes, that's all we do. All right. So I want to talk about the book of Job, because I think this is, it's not the last word on the question of evil and suffering, but it is a word. And it's more a corrective word. And with the book of Job, it begins with the assertion or the challenge that people are good because God rewards them. And so the point of punishment is to correct them. And if God is running his world correctly, then good is always rewarded and evil is always punished. Right? That kind of makes sense. So that's its starting position. And we know from at the beginning of the book, because we get that scene set in heaven, where Job is declared to be a righteous man, that Job is not guilty of sin. And so when suffering comes to him, what do his 3 church friends say to him? You must have sinned. Why do they believe he must have sinned? Because in a just world, God would reward goodness and punish evil. And if God is punishing you, if God is letting evil happen to you, then it must be because you've sinned. So that's what gets the book going, and you've got the fair sense of that repeated argument going on. Job, you tell me that you're righteous, but I know that you're not because you're suffering. Job's response is, I'm not sinning, therefore God is not playing right. He wants to drag God before a judge to find out why God is not playing fair, because God is meant to reward the righteous and punish evil. So Job has the same kind of viewpoint. He just knows that he's not the cause of this. So if he's not the cause, and he's thinking in a world of what the scholar was calling the justice principle. Yeah, he's accepting the justice principle that if God is a just God, then goodness is rewarded and evil is punished. So you've got the three friends who are saying, Job, you're guilty and you deserve this. You've got Job saying, I'm not guilty, I don't deserve this, therefore God is doing something wrong here. And then you've got the fourth friend, who's obviously just come back from seminary and so knows all the answers. And the fourth friend says, all right, I accept that you've not done anything wrong, but I'm also going to say that God is not, God only punishes those who are guilty. Therefore, I'm figuring that this punishment is because God knows that you're going to go off in the wrong direction, and this is going to correct you before you get there. So this punishment is corrective. Good job, God. And so now Job is guilty not of a past sin, but of a future sin that he hasn't committed. But God is right to invoke his punishment. So that's the framework. And then you get to the end of the book, and God says to Job, have you seen my monsters that what's it? Yeah, that's a hard word to say. It must be easier in South African or something. There's way too many syllables. So anyway, big sea monster. Sea monsters are about chaos and stuff like that. And God says, have you seen him? I feed him. And he's, what's it meant to be, the hippopotamus or something like that, pun? Oh, show off. All the big words, all right. Yeah, I know. I mean, not South African. She's not South African, but she's got that Lutheran. She's got that sophisticated Lutheran streak running through her. Yeah, that's sophisticated European kind of stuff. Yeah. You're in Australia now, girl. Forget all those big words. And God, what's that got to do with Job? What's that got to do with Job? Job's complaint against God. What has it got to do with a friend's defense? And what this person says in the Dictionary of Old Testament of Wisdom, Poetry, and Writing, if you want to read the article yourself, what he says is that the end result is that God says, I don't run the world by justice, I run the world by wisdom. And so we're looking for a kind of simple cause and effect kind of world, but God is running his world in wisdom and with wisdom. And that is, and that means that God doesn't have a simplistic cause and effect thing. Because, and have you watched The Good Place? The Good Place is 4 seasons and they tackle this pretty hard. If you're being good because you want to get to the good place, then it doesn't count. Because it's not goodness if it's for your own personal benefit. So you have to do goodness, you have to do good things, even if you're not going to go to the good place. But what's the point of doing good things if you don't get to the good place? So they're in that kind of justice principle kind of world. Good deeds equal good outcome. But what is happening in Job is that God is saying, I can bless people, but it doesn't have to be the kind of reward that is there for good behavior. That's just part of his generous act of blessing people. And Job proves this point. This is what the book of Job is about. Job proves that point by not following the advice of his wife, which was curse God and die. Job proved that you could stay committed to faithfulness towards God, even if it didn't come with rewards. Job didn't need rewards in order to attempt to be faithful to God. And so God can then bless Job without the fear that he's buying Job's allegiance. It is given. And in a good world that God has, and it is a good world that God has, Job can get the benefit of that without buying his allegiance. So the book of Job is a really important one in blowing out the water. One of our standard approaches: God rewards good behavior, punishes bad behavior, and brings us into a more sophisticated, nuanced world in which God is a God of wisdom. And yes, he does bless, and yes, he does put things in place to discourage or limit evil. But he's not doing it in a way that actually takes away, that buys a person's allegiance or punishes a person's.
Except,
Yeah.
we know that Job, everything is restored to Job, and more so than he had
Yes.
before. So when we read the story, there is the sense of his allegiance still got.
Except because he hung in there when the option in his standard worldview would have been, God is unfair to me, I will not follow him, curse God and die. Because he's proved that is not what his motivation is. God can laugh us. Because at the beginning of the book, that's a question. Is Job really a righteous man because he's got all this blessing?
I sometimes wonder though in the story whether it would have been better if they didn't have that at the end. I mean, as in, would it have still had the impact of like not being told that actually everything was okay and that God, because it almost counteracts some of what the story.
Yeah, it's hard to rewrite Job. So I'm not, but I think I want to say is, it's still our experience. I mean, it's my personal testimony that God has blessed me.
Yeah.
And I think it would be I mean, I've had a good life. My family has had a good life. So, and it would be a fair critique to say, well, I'm only in it because of the blessings, I guess I would want to say, and because God loves us, He blesses us and stuff like that, I would like to say that I am recipient of the blessing, but that's not what is the thing. So Job is not trying to say that God will not bless his people, because God does bless his people repeatedly. So it's not trying to say there's no blessing. It's just trying to say that the blessings aren't. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes, that's not what. So our faith in God is beyond that.
But when you read about a God like that, how can you not then? You see what I mean?
Well, that's
like
yes,
catch-22.
yes. So in this context, when we're faced with suffering, our question is Job's question: were we in it because we were guaranteed blessing, or were we in it because God is God, and we'll take the blessings thankfully, but even when there's no blessing, we will still turn our face towards God and give Him thanks. And that's some of the, will we accept from God good but not evil? I don't think that means God is handing out good and evil, but it's saying in the good times, I bless God. Am I going to stop blessing Him because there are no good things? Well, if that's the case, my blessing Him in the good times is starting to become suspect. Yeah, transactional. Yeah.
Tim Mackey of the Bible Project has over time adjusted his view on Job, and I think he's got a very good take on it. So the Bible has got repeated overarching stories like God blesses, Garden of Eden,
Yeah.
a mess happened.
Yeah.
Either our choice, Joseph
Yep.
got his brothers did bad to him.
Yeah.
The mess happened to you, or you causing it your own sin. In the end, God delivered, and He blessing far outweighs the first blessing. And He says it's that repeated story in the Bible. And the overarching Bibles, we start with Garden of Eden. We live our chaotic life in this chaotic place with all its evil and our own sin. Jesus died, and what we are going to receive far outweigh any good we already have on earth.
Yes.
So I think that end blessing that God gave to Job to me fits very well with what Revelation has.
Yeah. So I want to take that and just highlight that last part. Basically, when Job was written, there wasn't a whole lot of thought given to the afterlife. So if God didn't bless you in this life, there was no blessing to come. In Israel and in the Bible, that tends to change in what is called the Second Temple Judaism or intertestamental period, when we move from the Old Testament into the New. There's not a lot written in the Bible for that period. You kind of get to the end of the Old Testament, then you jump to the New Testament. But in that period is when Israel under threat of the Assyrians, developed martyrs for the faith. And so for the first time, people were being killed because they would stick with their Jewish faith instead of assimilating. And when you've got martyrs who have died for the faith, it's really hard to think in terms of blessings to come. Right? I mean, is a martyr cursed because they never got blessed? And the answer is, as we see in the cross and the future and Book of Revelation and stuff like that, that blessing is to come. And so even if Job was to have died in the misery, he will still have that blessing of being with God. But in the story itself, it's a little hard to convey that because they're not yet thinking of a resurrection and a new life. There's one reference to my Redeemer liveth in Job, but it's a partial kind of reference and not a clear theology of that yet. So that extra bit of seeing in the cross and then the future promise means that even if we die in the middle of our misery before we get to the second blessing, it doesn't mean that God doesn't bless us. So there is that eternal blessing. You going to say something?
Yeah, Psalm 73 is, I call it my woe-go on psalm, because it starts out, all these things, terrible things are happening in the world, like God's blessing these evil people and all that sort of stuff. But then I love how he goes into the temple, into the sanctuary, and he says, then I realise what's going to happen. And I guess that's the sovereignty of God, and the end thing is that evil is destroyed.
Defeated, yes. Probably in the psalm there's still a sense of he will see his enemies destroyed rather than a future thing, because there's still more focus on the immediate. But that sense of God does not play by our rules of what we think God ought to be, rewards good behavior, punishes bad behavior, and if you're being punished and you were good, it's because you're going to be bad, and he's getting in ahead of time. So that's kind of the framework that a lot of the Old Testament is kind of coming from. But Job, it stands as a real challenge to that whole thinking and invites us to think of a God who is bigger than that. And
I can't remember. Job is a really old piece of writing, isn't it? I can't remember.
Job is a timeless piece of writing in that it's not easily put into the Old Testament time frame. So the story within it doesn't have many markers that link it to a particular time. So it's wisdom literature, so it kind of floats outside of history. And so it's not, in a sense, that's why it rises above and critiques the theology that is common in Israel. Because it's not part of the development. It's not the culmination. It's not the starting point. It's just kind of a step aside, and let's critique what we've been accepting. So it's a little harder to.
So it's harder to date.
Yeah.
Because I thought it was one of the older pieces of writing. But maybe
this author thinks that the fourth friend represents the sophisticated Israelite view. So not pre-Israelite, but the sophisticated thinking. So that brings it further down the time frame. But Rowley, it's Rowley, who was one of my early favorite Old Testament writers. This is 2.6 on page 3. In his prosperity, Job thought he had known God. Now, at the end of the book, after God has spoken to him, now he realizes that compared with his former knowledge, his present knowledge is as the joy of seeing compared with a mere rumor. All his past experiences of God was as nothing compared with the experience he has now found. He therefore no longer cries out to be delivered from his suffering. He rests in God even in his pain. And I think that captures that sense of Job, what Job gets out of this is that he starts with a very shallow view of God. Job is being faithful. He won't curse God and die. He's being faithful, but he is criticizing God. He wants to hold God to account because God is not being what Job wants God to be. At the end of the book, he's realized that God is so much bigger than that. And that is, I think Rowley is suggesting, is one of the things that comes out through suffering. The shallowness, you can live a fairly shallow life in a life of blessing, is when you get into distress and suffering, that you can often get because you become deeper, you can obviously experience God at a deeper level. If you stay kind of shallow. So in my defense, I try and live empathetically. So even though I don't have troubles, I try and be genuinely listening to the suffering of others. And so I can discover that God is there even in difficult times. But other than that, if I didn't have empathy, I would just be one shallow little happy little Christian. So I think Job is a really interesting comment in terms of this dealing with evil and suffering. Right?
What I also like about the book of Job is that Job teaches us it's okay to question.
Oh yeah,
But
yeah.
it's not okay to judge.
Yes, yeah.
His friends were judging.
Oh, they were,
God
yes.
was God. And I feel like Job is saying, it's not my place to.
I think he gets pretty judgy with God's behavior.
Yeah, but it's more questioning.
But I do think, I definitely think, you cannot read the Old Testament and be afraid to question God.
Yeah.
Because they do it all the time. I mean, really, they do it all the time. And if you're not questioning God, then probably you're not paying attention. Yes, I like Habakkuk. Yeah, it depends on whether you're from South Jerusalem or not. In that, but that line that God is too pure to look upon evil. That's the prophet. That's not God. That's the prophet saying to God, "Look, I know you, and you can't get away with this. You can't do that." And God's response is, "Well, watch me." And then you finally get to that almost last verse. "And though the fig tree does not blossom, and there be no fruit on the vine, yet will I rejoice in the Lord." And you've seen the prophet move from that kind of telling God what he can and can't do to recognizing that God is governing the world in wisdom and that he will rejoice in God. And so this idea of God is not a God of justice in a naive cause and effect kind of way, but that God is a God of wisdom who works justice and mercy, I think is a key part of the book of Job. I want to briefly touch on the cross and Revelation, briefly, because I think we'll be more aware of that. I want to start by saying what I said in one of the previous teaching series. There is no cosmic rule that God cannot forgive without blood sacrifice. There is no rule that God cannot forgive without blood sacrifice. The fact that we think that's what it is represents our way of we forgive we forgive when somebody earns the forgiveness. God forgives generously, and he calls us to forgive generously. So it doesn't make sense to think that God can only forgive by sacrificing his only son. What happens, and this is what I was arguing in Teaching Series 3, what happens is that God comes into the world and enters fully into our suffering and becomes fully the victim of evil. And rather than God attempting to wipe out all those who oppose him, he accepts all that evil against him absorbs our sin and our evil, and then rises again and creates a new world. God absorbs the evil and the sin that is done to him, and transforms that or redeems it. And so nothing is bought or purchased. I mean, we use the language as part of the imagery, but there's no transaction made. It is God forgiving by accepting all the suffering that we put on him. Now, I took 4 weeks to try and explain that last time. If that didn't work in 1 minute, go back to the 4 weeks. But I don't think God is forced. What happens is that God willingly accepts the pain and suffering of the world and overcomes it. So suffering is not something that God has to stay clear of. Suffering is not something God is afraid of because it's dirty and messes up his world. It is something that he will take into himself and redeem and restore. So it has God makes it redemptive. And so what was the most evil act of all history becomes the cause of our salvation. I mean, like, how great is God? I mean, really, how clever is that? All evil is seeking to destroy God, and in doing so, it just becomes a means of redeeming the world. And so I think that teaches us that God works in and through suffering. He doesn't have to cause it. He doesn't have to be controlling it. But he's able to work in and through it to achieve his purposes. And so I think the cross is a great example of that. And the Revelation is, I think, a kind of great, was it Sunday? Was it Sunday or the week before with you? Talking about looking at the end of the book to find out what happened. Was that Sunday? It was Jenny. Yeah. Pamela in the intro. Yeah. Yes. Right. Yes. That's why I couldn't quite play it. But yes, that idea. I am a Richmond football fan, and which means that. Well, some things you just have to put up with. But it means that, we had 4 good years, so that, I'm celebrating that. But outside of that, you lose as many as you win, or sometimes you lose a lot more than you win. And so because it distresses me, seriously, it distresses me when they lose. I don't watch the game until I know the result. And so I've never seen Richmond lose, except live. I mean, one who wants to be entertained rather than when I go to a movie, I want to know, is it a comedy or is it tragic? And if it's tragic, I'll find something else to watch. So when I go into a game, when there's a game on, it's recording, and if we win, I start, and I enjoy it. I mean, really, I enjoy what we can fall behind, but I don't care because we're going to win. We can get out in front, and I don't have to worry. As a Richmond supporter, you know that you can lose with 8 goals in front with 7 minutes to go, right? That's distressing. You can't sit back and enjoy it. I was rewatching the 2017 grand final for the Crows supporters. Richmond were way out in front, but the chief executive officer and the chair of the board did not rejoice, did not celebrate until there was about 5 minutes to go and we were 40 points in front. Up till then, there was always danger. And so it's hard to enjoy it. It's hard to celebrate the goal because it might not be the goal that wins it. I enjoy a game when I know the outcome. And Revelation is that. I mean, even if the church is falling behind, I don't have to worry. I know we're going to win. And if we're out in front, I don't need to spend all my time worrying about what might go wrong. I know we're going to win it. I do go to some live games, and really, it's a stress. And I think, yes, anyway, that's a different story. We're moving on. We're starting to look at my psychological faults there. But anyway, Revelation to me is we know that we win in the end. Let me, page 5, what the Bible teaches us about living with suffering and evil. Loving God means loving in concrete acts of compassion and kindness one another, our neighbors, and even our enemies. The parable of the Samaritan describes the characteristics, actions of a person who truly knows God. Remember the start of the parable? The biblical scholar comes to Jesus and to test him and says, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And so when he asks that question, he's asking, because eternal life belongs to the people of God. So he's asking, how do I know that I'm part of God's people? And Jesus says to him, well, you've got the law. What does it say? Love God, love your neighbor. And Jesus says, got it. And that's to move on. And the biblical scholar, wanting to justify himself, says, who's my neighbor? And yet the parable doesn't answer that question, because the person in the story actually is helped by an enemy, a Samaritan. And so it's like a standard joke. The priest, the Levite, and the common Jew. I mean, that's how the story goes. The priest and the Levite are the bad ones, and the common Jew ends up being the hero of the story. But Jesus makes this a story of the priest, the Levite, the common Jew is actually lying in the ditch, and so brings in the Samaritan. And so the Samaritan becomes the person who is representing the people of God by acting in a neighborly way, loving the person in need. And the Samaritan, I mean, this is, you may or may not know, but the Samaritan is essentially our religious opponent to the Jews. They're not just enemies. I mean, when I was young, the Samaritan used to be the bikie with a leather jacket, because that was as wild as we could imagine anything. And a tattoo in there, definitely Samaritans with tattoos. But that's not who the Samaritans were, not people who were socially different or whatever. It was a person who actually thought that they were closer to God than you were. So Jehovah's Witness, Mormon, someone who claims to be Christian, but truly Christian, not like you guys are Christian. Would you accept salvation advice from a JW or a Mormon? Well, not likely. Salvation Army is a little, just a little, but certainly not JW and Mormon. We can agree about that. And yet, why? Theologically, they had the wrong Bible, they had the wrong take on it, they had the temple in the wrong place, they got it all wrong. Theologically, they got it all wrong. And yet, when Jesus looked for someone who could be an example of the people of God, he picked them. Why? Because he lived in love. He lived with God's love, and you can only live with God's love if you're responding to God's love in your life. That's, we have to take that out of the Bible. Or we could start believing it. I mean, one or the other, but Yeah, we might as well take that. Out it goes. Yes. So loving God means that we actually have to love our neighbor, love our enemies. We have to enter into people's suffering and the evil that they experience, not stand on the sideline. The priest and the Levite, that's going to be a disappointing conversation at some point. You mean I was meant to stop? But I was on my way to chapel. The way of God is the way of the cross. I've tried to argue that already. God goes through suffering and evil in order to reconcile the world to himself. We are to be followers of God in his way. There is no universe in the world. I don't care how many Marvel universes they develop. There is no universe in the world in which the Crusades, the Inquisitions, and burning witches, or the witch trials, are part of God's way of dealing with the world. That just does not work at any level. And the fact that the church thought it did, and significant parts of the church thought it did, is probably a judgment on the church rather than on God. God wants us to actually go his way of experiencing suffering in order to overcome it. We confront evil with the love of God, knowing that God will triumph in the end and make his home among us. In our suffering, we choose to find the presence of God and move towards him for healing and new life. In the suffering of others, we embody the presence of God and offer healing, perseverance, and comfort. Pages 6 and 7, if you've been paying attention to your notes, has appeared every week, and I haven't covered it yet, so I will mention it tonight. But really, it's just to say, while we are sitting around having questions about why is there suffering and evil in a world created by a good God, I think there has to be atheists and secularists sitting around somewhere trying to come up with the answer to why is there goodness in the world. There is more goodness than there is evil. There is more care than there is suffering. Now, I get that there are terrible things happening all over the world, but on the ground, you will find acts of love and compassion going on by people who are starving, who are getting food for others, people who are taking the last bits of water they have and sharing it with their neighbors. There is love and compassion going on that you just cannot explain, I think, in a world without God. Richard Dawkins came up with this selfish gene that we have some genetic makeup that makes us want to protect the survival of the species, and therefore we will do acts of compassion and altruism. Maybe, but I doubt it. I mean, it doesn't. It explains. It explains why you die before your kids. You die to keep your kids alive. That's the future. All right, so that's your genetic thing. But why would you die for a stranger? Why would you die for an enemy? And those we see time and time again, love in a way that we can't explain on the self-interest level. Where does that come from? And I think if we stop, we'll see that we're not living in hell all over the world, all over. Even people in the most desperate of situations are caring for one another. Even in the midst of famine and disease, people are having and raising and caring for children, trying to love them and support them. All around us, we see evidence of that, and I think we shouldn't dismiss that. We shouldn't treat it lightly. I think it's evidence of the goodness of God built into the world that he creates. That's just care and compassion. Now, maybe there are arguments against it, but they'd be as complicated as the Calvinist ones. The plain sense reading of what goes on is, I think, points to a God who is loving at work in the world. Now, I want to take a bit of time to page 8 and 9, because I think it's a good test for where we, so this is your test, so I will be grading your answers on this. And at the end, maybe I'll just say all the A students, the B, C, D, or is it A, B, C, D, whatever. What do you say to a person who's grieving? So that I read an interesting article, which you've got on those 2 pages recently, from someone whose child was stillborn on New Year's Eve in 2003, New Year's Eve 2003. This article was written 21 years later and deals with her advice on what people said to her in the midst of her grief and her responses to it. So the bit in bold are the comments that were made to her, and then the paragraph below it is her response to it. But I wonder, what do we say, or what do you say to someone who goes into hospital expecting to give birth to the baby's name is Ben, to a son, with all his life in front of him, as he comes home just with the handprints and footprints of the baby that's died? I mean, what do you say?
Sorry says it all, right?
Yeah. I'm sorry.
I don't think you need to say anything. You need to listen.
Yes. So, I mean, I think the compassion is to not do what the Job's friends do, jump to an answer. But many people do. Many church people do. But you don't have to be a Christian to give bad responses to this kind of stuff. But sometimes it helps. But compassion, sorry, and to actually locate yourself alongside the person and weep with them, weep with those who weep, is the thing. But what are some of the things that people say in that situation? Yeah.
Number 6 really stands out to me. It's too horrific for me to think about. And I think that's something that people do say.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, I can't imagine what that's like. And
I don't want to.
Yeah.
That's right.
See, and that's the bit where you lose the compassion.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because what you're saying is, this is a horror. You stay on that side. I'll stay on this side where, I'm in a good world and God is looking after me, kind of thing. But and that's the horror of it, that you leave the person alone. And what we're saying in terms of a good response is you want to be with the person in that situation. This is horrific. I will sit here and weep with you. Is a full response because you recognize the horror of it. But other people are trying to find ways to de-horrify it.
And these all tend to be statements.
Yes, these are things that people.
Rather than like asking questions about.
These are things people said to her.
Yeah. But like to get somebody to open up.
Yes, no, I'm not disagreeing with that. It's a good approach. I'm just saying.
You ask questions and
Yeah.
that sort of thing. Whereas this is is all statements, this is all telling them
Yes.
how they should feel or how
Yes.
they
So why do
should
people
act
do that?
or how they should do.
Why do people do that?
Because they feel they need to fix it.
Why do they feel they need to fix it? Oh, you don't. They don't know what.
They don't know what to say.
Well, sometimes if you don't know what to say, you say nothing. Why do they feel the need to say something?
Because they think it's required of them.
Yeah.
Sometimes people just want it to say something or make everything comfortable. Because if you've got someone in front of you in a place of real suffering and grief, it's a very uncomfortable thing to sit.
So who do? Yeah. So who do they want to be comfortable?
Me.
Yeah.
Themselves.
Yeah. And so, and part of that is then to reorder their world, because people get afraid. Not that evil or suffering is catching, but it can be distressing to think that that person is just like me and this has happened to them. It could happen to me. So it's better to try and create a world in which they're not like me. So they sinned, or their family sinned, or something. We're looking for a reason to make ourselves feel comfortable, or to reassert our understanding of the world. If God is always good, then if God is controlling everything and that's good, then you're overdoing this. It can't be as bad as you say, because God wouldn't let it happen. So they're trying to control the world because they're afraid of a God who is bigger than that, because that makes their life uncertain. I mean, God must have needed another angel. I mean, that's meant to be sweet. But in what world? I mean, so her response is that I'm sorry, God is a jerk. To rip a child from the mother because God wants an angel, he can make his own. But they want to say that God, they want to live in a world in which God is controlling everything. And so God has to have a reason for this. And so everything happens for a reason. What I've heard people say, and this is sometimes the people who have gone through it themselves, is that God knew that something was bad going to happen, and so they took them early. And I think, if God knew that, why did he not fix that? I mean, really, if you've got the choice here, why take the child? Why not just change the circumstances or something? But we're afraid of chaos. We're afraid of that uncertainty in it. Did you read that 11 missionaries, YWAM missionaries, died a few days ago in a road accident in Nigeria, African country, something like that. But 11 missionaries died, YWAM missionaries, and these were the leaders. These were the kind of, it was on a training session, and so these were the top leaders, and the students were the top students that had come to the special training session. So they lost the largest loss to YWAM in its 60-year history. How do you make sense of something like that? Yeah?
I think, for me, and this is probably the most helpful thing I got out of it for nights.
Well, I'm writing this down.
Is the last sentence
Yes.
in the opening paragraph.
Yep.
Because I've often felt that I've been in a situation like a friend dying long before he could.
Yeah.
Where she says, I longed for the chance to have an honest conversation about what I was feeling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And to me, that is just so helpful.
Yes.
Because then I don't have to worry about trying to put the world right.
or trying to defend God.
trying to defend or anything like that. It's just, and this person is telling me, I just long for someone to have an honest conversation.
Yeah.
That's compassion.
Yes, compassion. Yes, yes, to be with the person.
Yeah.
So Jesus is a high priest who has entered into our weakness and suffered our trials and temptation. And yes, and so that incarnation, that entering in, is how God confronts suffering. And so that's what we're called to do, is follow in that kind of example. Move on from your anger, or it's time. Move on from your anger, or it's time to play it down. Is attempting to do what? To minimize or to de-evil the event. And what I want to say with my kind of diagram of how we move forward is you don't de-evil the event. What you do is you work with God to find the next step. And you do that not by, well, I think you do it first by finding God's presence in it. And so what I would say is, if we are present with people in their suffering, truly present, then God is present. It's one of my first. I've said this in a sermon, but one of my first pastoral emergencies was a adult son who had committed suicide, and I sat with the mother. And she was sitting on the bed, and she was just rocking back and forward and rubbing her hand on her knee, just rocking back and forward. And I was 26 or something. What did I know? And so all I did was sit with her. And she remembers that as the presence of Jesus with her. I certainly wasn't saying anything clever. I was just being there, keeping my mouth shut, not because I knew better, but because I really did have nothing to say, and to that. But it was the presence that was important, because at the first step to going through the suffering is to find God's presence with us. Now that's not a light on, light off kind of thing. It fades in and fades out and stuff. I'm not quite sure when she said this to me, but she said, "I feel like my prayers are bouncing off the ceiling." I said, "That's not a problem, because God's not on the other side of the ceiling. God is here with you. And if your prayers are bouncing on the ceiling, then that's fine. They're going right to him." But she was starting from a position of God is far away. But the dealing with it, or the experience of it, starts with trying to find God in the now, in the presence of God. And we look for it not in spectacular miracles or words of wisdom or whatever. We just first of all find it in quiet presence. And so what you were saying, what John was saying, that idea of being with is, and not saying anything, I think is part of what we learn from thinking through how God is dealing with evil and suffering in the world. He's certainly not an excuse. It's time to stop talking about him. How can you move forward by leaving him behind? Nobody leaves behind a dead baby. It's just, you carry that every day. And so what you're saying is, I don't want to carry that forward. So you stop talking to me about it. You carry it. I'll just pretend it didn't happen. No, you've got to. I think the person in their ignorance is trying to say something like, you can grow from this. You can, but you don't grow in this by actually denying it. You can only grow by actually accepting the reality of it and moving forward. So I mean, I stuck it. Yeah.
I think also there's that dangerous place when people start asking you in their group why.
Oh
You
yes.
try an answer because we feel like we should have an answer because they look at you with such desperation of like, why is this happening to me? And the answer is evil is real.
Yeah.
We don't
Yeah.
understand
Yes.
this. But I think we're too quick in that space to try and work out the theology when people aren't asking.
Or try to defend God.
Oh,
Yeah.
to defend God or
And they're looking for a purpose, as if what purpose could justify or explain. But at the time, they're just because they've lived in a world up to then, in which it really wasn't bad if it had a purpose. Now they've come across real evil, and it has no purpose. God can make something good of it, but it doesn't give it a purpose. That is a God thing rather than an event thing. And that's why did these 11 missionaries die? Well, 25 people died it was a 4-vehicle car crash. 25 people died, 11 of them were missionaries. The first answer is, in whatever country it was, road deaths are the 7th biggest cause of deaths and the brakes failed of the truck that smashed into that caused the accident, and the brakes failed. Well, why did the brakes fail? Human negligence, or corporate greed, or a desperate person trying to make a living when they, couldn't afford to fix their truck, or who knows. There's a chaotic factor in there. Why that intersection at that time? There's a sinful factor. There's a bad roads, evil. There's multiple factors. Who knows? But not at the time. But later, I try and say, well, if you did have an answer, would it make a difference? And sometimes they think it would, but I've never really met someone for which an answer actually took away the pain. Rabbi Kushner, I've jumped to, because this isn't his book is really interesting. I mean, it's a very genuine, but he's Jewish, so he uses the Old Testament. He doesn't have the New Testament to kind of help him work through this. So I think there's a bit of a difference. But he says, and this is page 13, middle page 13, I'm a more sensitive person, a more effective pastor, and a more sympathetic counselor because of Aaron's life and death than I ever would have been without it. And I would give all those gains up in a second if I could have my son back. Yes, good things, God can work good things out of it, but it doesn't take away the evil of it. If I could choose, I would forego all the spiritual growth and depth that has come my way because of our experience. But I cannot choose. But what we can choose is what comes next. And I think in truth, that's what Rabbi Kushner has done. He's made a very significant contribution to care and compassion in a world of grief because of that. But I wouldn't want to say that was the purpose of his son's death. I would say that's God turning evil into good, God redeeming a terrible thing, making it good. There's a whole set of various Christian theodicies, explanations in there. I mean, in all of my notes, I always start from my least favorite through to the my preferred ones. So in terms of my preference, the idea of a suffering God, the cross is God's answer to human suffering, Moltmann. Clark Pinnock's openness theodicy, God wants genuinely loving relationships. This involves the risk of rejection. Clark Pinnock came to the Baptist College in Adelaide. I got him to come out just after he retired, and he preached. Well, he taught on this, and he was passionately eloquent in his love of God and his horror that anyone would think that God caused evil, sexual assault. I mean, and in the middle of this lecture, he swears. He's really worked up, and all the Baptist pastors afterwards. I was the principal of the college. All the Baptist pastors came up to me and afterwards, because I always transcribe the lectures and put them into a journal and make it available to people. They said, "Are you keeping that in?" They were more worried about the swear word, and it was on the scale of things, it was East Canadian, so it was kind of mild, even for a swear word, it was kind of mild. But they were more worried about that than Clark's horror of thinking that God is not the God of love, that God doesn't weep. Back to Calvin's merchant wandering through the forest. Clark is at the other end of that, and some people think he's a heretic. I think he's a great. I think he's a great Christian, but he would be horrified that the answer to the story was that, well, that was God's will. It must be good, rather than crying, weeping with the family of the merchant and stuff. The horror of something like this, and so not just because Clark is clever, Clark Pinnock is a clever theologian, but because I think he's got the heart of God. That I think that was part of why I think this is not a conversation about theology. This is a conversation about who God is and how He works in the world. So I've got a conclusion there. Constructing a theodicy, how I put it all together in the end. But basically, that's only a summary repeat of what I've been saying. But I think it starts with recognizing the reality of evil and calling it evil and not trying to massage it into something less than that. It's evil. Even if we're the cause of it, it's sin, but it's evil. Suffering is evil. Yeah.
I was reading something in last week, and it was talking about the verse in Romans that talks about hating evil.
Yes.
And my thoughts were around, well, yes, I hate evil that is, injustice, things like that. But then what about, is evil sin? equals sin. And in that case, then it's the whole, you know, pick the sin but not the sinner sort of type.
I'm sorry,
No.
I think
It's true.
I think I would want to say that a lot of the biblical framework is about sin with a capital S, crouching at the door, seeking to master you. Romans 7 is about being enslaved to sin. I think God would look at sin in us as a cancer, as something that is just taking away our opportunity to be loved and to receive love and give love, and so he would weep at that. So I think it's about that kind of response rather than an abstraction of God hates it and will have nothing to do with sinners, because that's the kind of Pharisees and
even like the where to hate sin. So therefore, and I'm sure this has been the basis of a lot of stuff that's going on in the church, is that, oh, we hate sin, so therefore that person's doing that sort of behaviour, that's sinful, God said not to do that, therefore we hate that.
Yeah, well, all right.
That's where the hate is.
Yeah, my 1 minute simple response to that is that sin is about turning our back on God and wandering from God, not breaking a law kind of thing. It's personal. And so if you want to hate the sin, you've got to love the sinner. You've got to love them towards God, not hate them away from God. And because if you hate them away from God, you're just encouraging sin. And so if you want to do something about stopping sin, you love people. You hold them closer, not push them away. And nobody ever changed their behavior because somebody told them off. They change their behavior because they are loved and they want to emulate the people that love them. And so it's an excuse usually to not love. And not love is just the fundamental cause of sin and suffering. Oh, well, some suffering in the world. And it's dealt with love. Always, and back to the cross, God always deals with it with love. I've said it way too many times, but the prodigal son is really the lens through which I read the gospel. The father runs towards the son and welcomes him home. That's how you deal with sin. In a room, it's hard to tell what people's backgrounds are and stuff like that. But the idea that pushing someone away from your family or from your church because they don't meet behavior standards, rather than pulling towards them, is crazy to me. I mean, it's just, how do you expect that ever to work? And some people need a lot of loving because they are a lot broken. And yeah, you have to have, it has to be real love, not thing. It has to be real love, but it has to be love.
You've also got to retain a safe environment. You've also got to,
yeah,
you've got to keep within the law. You've got to. There's all kinds of stuff with that.
Yeah, but it should always be love, and those other things are problems that have to be solved. They're not reasons to stop loving. Yeah. Anyway, that takes us 4 weeks into this, and you're thinking to yourself, we've been doing this for 4 weeks, and I've still got all those questions. Well, welcome to theology. But I am always willing. I will even buy the coffee. I will even buy the coffee. I'm always willing to catch up with anyone and listen to your views. Really, a free coffee, it just gives me an excuse. So, so it looks like I'm working. So that's how I do my Tuesdays and Wednesdays. Oh yeah, I'm just off to have a coffee. And it helps if there's somebody there rather than just off to have my coffee. So it helps me. It helps me. All right, let's finish in prayer. Loving God, sovereign creator, redeemer of all things, we entrust ourselves and all those we love into your compassionate kindness. But there are times when the darkness rises up to swallow us, and we fear that you have abandoned us to your enemies. We look for simple answers as to why bad things happen to good people, and we find ourselves caught between condemning the victim for sin past or future, known or unknown, or condemning you for faithlessness. Forgive us, we pray, for our quickness to judge others with a harshness that lacks your love for them and for justice. Forgive us, we pray, when we demand you justify yourself to us for failing to reward us for any small act of righteousness. But with Job, we have grown through our wrestling with you, and we have come to stand in awe of a God who governs his world in wisdom. Your creation is more complex than doctrines of karma and determinism can describe. Because you are triune love, you created us in your image to receive and respond to love, or to hide from and to misuse love. We accept our responsibility as faithless lovers for creating pathways for sin and evil and chaos that fracture and decay your very good world. As Easter approaches, we stand with your church in awe of a God who redeems his world through the weakness and folly of the cross. We did not stand apart from the suffering and evil. You did not stand apart from the suffering and evil that overtakes us, but as our high priest, you entered our weaknesses and our suffering and our trials. You entered our lives as the incarnate Emmanuel, who stands faithful and true. You are the slain lamb who conquers evil and redeems his creation in love. You will make your home with us in the New Jerusalem, and there will be healing for the nations. There will be no more death, or sorrow, or crying, or pain. Evil is not forever. Give us clear eyes that we discern your presence in each of our trials. Give us trusting hearts that will walk with you as you heal and restore us and conform us to the image of Christ Jesus. Give us grateful hands that will join with you in the care and nurture of the broken, the injured, and the grieving. May we, by our godly acts of love and justice, be light to a world that needs to see God's merciful and just presence at work in their trials. May we, by our acts of compassion for neighbors and for enemies, give hope to a world that has lost hope in the promises of the coming Lord to heal the nations. Amen.